Among the most well-known figures in the Bible, Abraham's life and the wisdom it contains might fill a book. Fifthly, I will talk about 5. Summary of the story of Abraham. Here is a quick overview of Abraham's story in case you don't know it or want to review it. Genesis chapter 12 is where his narrative starts. God advised Abraham to leave his nation when he was 75 years old. An additional promise from God was to transform him into a nation that would be a blessing to others. God keeps reminding Abraham of his promises even when he grows rich and separates from his nephew Lot, who he brought with him. Even though Sarah was sterile and Abraham was advanced in years, God nonetheless gave him the promise of a son. Over the course of their continued dialogue, God changed Abraham's name from Abram to Abraham and Sarah from Sarai. Sarah convinces Abraham to have an affair with her servant so that they can have a kid through her because she recognizes that they are not growing younger. Abraham listens to her counsel, but it causes tension between Sarah and Hagar in the end. Eventually, at the most improbable moment, God provided for Sarah and Abraham, and they had a boy they called Isaac. God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac as a test at a later time. By carrying out his plan, Abraham demonstrated his reverence for God, but just as he was about to slaughter Isaac, God intervened. What are the 5 most important lessons that we may take away from the narrative of Abraham? We will examine these lessons one by one. Number 1. Start moving in faith when the way isn't clear. One remarkable thing about Abraham is that he obeyed God even when his commands were vague. Listen to the initial directions Abraham was given by God, according to the Bible. The beginning of Genesis 12 contains it. Following the Lord's command, Abram was to leave his homeland, his family, and the household of his father and journey to the land that the Lord would show him. Genesis 12 verse 1, NIV. Going to the land of the Canaanites was not God's will for Abraham. Neither did God instruct him to travel in a specific direction. God promised Abraham a place that he would reveal to him. Even though the instructions were vague, Joseph proceeded as the Lord had told him, NIV, according to Genesis 12 verse 4. When God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, a comparable incident happened. What followed was God's command to Abraham to bring his son, Isaac, to the land of Moriah. On a mountaintop I will show you, sacrifice him as a burnt offering. Genesis 22 verse 2 in the New International Version. God instructed Abraham to journey to a mountain that he would later reveal, and he also gave him the seemingly insane task of sacrificing his son, Isaac. But early the next morning Abraham got up and brought Isaac there, as stated in the verse that follows. Following God's voice, Abraham did what was required of him without specific directions. Neither did he put things off until later. Finally, God guided him precisely as God had promised. When we feel God's call on our lives, we should follow in Abraham's footsteps and put our trust in God. God seems to lead his people step by step rather than providing them with a roadmap ahead of time. Do not let the thought of all the things you will need or the difficulties that may arise divert you from what God is leading you to do. God will provide guidance and direction as you travel. Number 2. You can be godly and wealthy. One of the things believers may struggle with is the idea of becoming wealthy in this life. Reason being, evil tends to be connected with those having a lot of money. In spite of the verses that say the love of money is the root of all evil and you cannot serve both God and money, Matthew 6 verse 24 NIV, it's not an issue to have a lot of money. If we believe this to be true, we may not be able to help other people as much as we could. We learn from Abraham's life that it is possible to be pious and affluent, along with a handful of other biblical figures. According to Genesis 13 verse 2, Abraham had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold, NIV, when he departed from Egypt. Indeed, their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together, Genesis 6 verse 6 NIV, which is the exact reason Abraham and Lot had to part ways. Believing the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness, Genesis 15 verse 6 NIV, is what Abraham did when God told him that his descendants would be as many as the stars, even though he was already very wealthy. Also, the angel of the Lord said, "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Genesis 22 verse 12 NIV, after confirming to God that he would sacrifice Isaac, his beloved son, as God had instructed. These things show that Abraham was a righteous man, and the fact that he was also quite wealthy demonstrates that Christians can have it both ways. Be generous with your wealth. As godly people who are wealthy, we ought to have a spirit of generosity, and our hearts ought to always be at a position where we would give everything up for God if He commanded us to do so. From Abraham's life, we can deduce this. He was kind when he gave Lot first dibs on the land when they had to part, Genesis 13 verse 9 NIV. Abraham bestowed 1/10 of all his possessions upon him after receiving the blessing of King Melchizedek of Salem. Abraham would have gladly given up all his wealth if God had asked him to by not withholding his son, Isaac, from God. Let us not, as believers, shun accumulating wealth just because some of us may have been led to believe that money is bad. Get rich if you want to, but don't put God last. We are able to provide more when our resources are ample. Number 3. Be careful who you take advice from. God did not specify the means by which Abraham would conceive the son He had promised him the first time. A son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir, Genesis 15 verse 4 NIV, was the only thing God mentioned. At first, everything was well because Abraham believed it. "The Lord has kept me from having children," Sarah told him one day. "Possibly I can start a family with my slave if you go have sex with her," Genesis 16 verse 2 NIV. According to Scripture, Abraham agreed with Sarah, therefore the request appeared reasonable to him. It made sense at the time, but we now know that this was not God's will. Arguing ensued because Abraham listened to Sarah's counsel without seeking God's counsel. Genesis 16 verse 4 says that when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, NIV, referring to Hagar, Sarah's slave whom Abraham slept with. Sarah warned Abraham, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering," Genesis 16 verse 5 NIV, even though it was her suggestion. Next, be wary of the people you listen to when they offer you advice. This is the second lesson Abraham's experience teaches us. We shouldn't immediately take someone's advice just because it looks sensible. What others may consider sound advice may not be suitable for us, and acting on it without additional guidance could cause issues. As believers, we should constantly consult God, and it's always a good idea to seek a second viewpoint. Abraham might have gotten a different message from God, that he would have a son through Sarah, if he had sought God's wisdom first, rather than Sarah's, Genesis 17 verse 16. Seek His will in everything you do. This lesson from Abraham goes hand in hand with what Proverbs 3 verse 6 tells believers to do. Seek His will in all that you do, and He will show you the way, NLT. Seek His will in all that you do, not just some, according to the adage. Be cautious and seek God's will about every issue, no matter how insignificant it seems or how sound someone's advice may sound. Number 4. The impossible isn't always impossible. We know that having a child with Sarah was one of the obstacles Abraham faced for the most of his life. According to Genesis 12 verse 4 NIV, he was 75 years old when he set out from Haran, the exact age at which God initially commanded him to abandon his homeland. By the time God summoned him, he had likely already come to the conclusion that Sarah's chances of having a child were slim. Sarah having a child seemed impossible. It became very clear to Abraham and Sarah as they aged that they could never have a child together. Genesis 17 verse 17 describes what happened when God told Abraham that he would have a son through Sarah. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? When Sarah is 90 years old, will she be able to have a child?" Neve. Sarah, according to the next chapter of the Bible, was well past her reproductive years when she chuckled to herself and asked, "Will I now have this pleasure?" in response to the Lord's announcement that Abraham would have a child. Hebrews 18 verse 12, NIV. What God had promised did come to pass, as you likely already know, even if it seemed impossible. Isaac was born to Sarah when Abraham was nearly a century old. The fact that Abraham's seemingly impossible dream came true reminds us that our wildest dreams can come true. Many things were thought impossible. When Roger Bannister ran the mile in under 4 minutes, everyone felt it was impossible. Before it happened, a lot of things, including climbing mountains and going to space, were considered impossible. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Is a question God posed to Abraham. Hebrews 18 verse 14, NIV. If you take a page out of Abraham's story and prepare yourself to be amazed, God may fulfill an unbelievable promise he made to you. Even if other people think it's impossible, you should never let that stop you from pursuing your dreams. Keep moving forward, disregarding their narrow viewpoints. With God, the sky is the limit. According to Matthew 19 verse 26. Number 5. Sometimes it's better to separate. As wonderful as it is to be a family, there are times when it's best to be apart for the benefit of harmony. This difficulty arose twice for Abraham in the Bible. This difficulty initially arose with Lot. The shepherds of Abraham and Lot began to fight because the land could not support their massive amounts of belongings, according to the Bible. They broke up for the sake of one another. For the second time, Abraham encountered this difficulty when Sarah forbade Hagar and Ishmael from being present, on the grounds that she did not want Ishmael to inherit any of Isaac's wealth. Earlier in this piece, we saw that Sarah and Hagar were having problems, so Sarah asked Abraham to banish them. The fact that Abraham had a son named Ishmael made the matter distress Abraham greatly, Genesis 21 verse 11 NIV. Unfortunately, God gave Abraham the green light to listen to Sarah this time, Genesis 21 verse 12. Separation was required in each case when tensions first started to rise. First, we find that Abraham did not turn against Lot, rather, he rescued him from captivity in the midst of a war, Genesis 14. In the second instance, we have no choice but to accept God's approval. From this, we can learn that while collaborating is ideal, there will be moments when it's necessary to split for the benefit of peace. Forcing collaboration might cause anger and make things worse, so it's best to do it sooner rather than later so that the separation can be done in love. As far as your actions are concerned, if it is possible, live at peace with everyone, NIV, according to Romans 12 verse 8. The wise flee from peril, while the foolish persist until they pay the price, Proverbs 27 verse 12 NIV. As a Christian, you should use discernment and do what you can to maintain peace in your relationships, even if it means going your separate ways when you feel tension rising. It is definitely a remarkable narrative, the one about Abraham. It's full with valuable lessons that can improve our lives. Here are a few things to keep in mind. You can be godly and prosperous. You should be careful with the counsel you follow. The impossible isn't really impossible, and occasionally, separating is the best option for peace. God be with you.